So yes, I agree. It makes sense to review things sequentially, but start with need and environmental harm. And just to review, that this board decided on October 31st, 2018, that the advisory opinion of the PUC was stale, and we therefore rejected the advisory opinion. We have that responsibility under the Act to either reject or accept or modify advisory opinions, and we rejected that one because so many things had changed since that one-person decision by the PUC. And again, you mentioned that we received advisory opinions from 12 entities, including the PUC, and I just want to emphasize that it was the PUC that was asked to address need. And they were asked to address need, which is specified under the statute, and we also issued a preliminary order asking them to address need and to conduct an investigation. And in that hearing that they held, and that whole record is part of our record, they took comment and were advised by statewide planning and by the Office of Energy Resources, and then they rendered an opinion. And as mentioned, we rejected that opinion, so it's really our determination now, our independent determination on need in front of this board. I wanted to start by just talking a bit about the term or the phrase long-term. Invenergy's brief had a fairly lengthy section about long-term, and they did cross-examine some of the witnesses on the phrase long-term. But Chairperson, you read the standard under Section 11, and it's really Section 11 that has the dispositive standards that we need to think about and make a finding on in terms of whether this facility will be approved. And that standard is, again, construction of the proposed facility is necessary to meet the needs of the state and or region for energy of the type to be produced by the proposed facility. So long-term is a phrase that's in the Declaration of Policies in Section 2 of the Act, and it talks about long-term in the context of the energy plan, we're in the state guide plan, and that we need to make a decision that's justified by a long-term forecast. But when I look at Section 11, which is really the controlling part, I'm just struck in terms of statutory construction that long-term is actually not in that standard, and that was in my mind as I was reading about the debate about what does long-term really mean. In their post-hearing memo, the applicant also leaned heavily on the conclusions of the advisory opinion of the statewide planning program in making their argument in favor of need. And again, the board didn't ask the statewide planning to advise us on need. So they were asked to advise us on several specific elements, socioeconomic impact, consistency with the state guide plan, and an examination of the consistency with the state energy plan. There's nothing in our rules that asks statewide planning to be the expert on need. So given that, to me it kind of took the legs out of from beneath Invenergy's argument on that point, because in relying so heavily on statewide planning, that was an expert opinion on whether it conformed to the state guide plan and on other elements, but it really wasn't our expert on need. And I thought their advisory opinion was a good one in terms of their conclusions on the state guide plan and the state energy plan. So a little bit more on long-term. All of the witnesses who testified, including the experts from Invenergy, Mr. Highland and Mr. Transpose that, Mr. Hardy and Mr. Nyland, agreed that when you look out past 10 years, it's very, very uncertain, that it's difficult to forecast. They become, and I think we've seen that looking back, and I was struck in the last hearing, Mr. Nyland acknowledged that it's just difficult to look beyond 10 years, and the ISO's forecast is 10 years. So just to kind of conclude on long-term, I don't feel that this board is required to look out 20 years in terms of the standard under Section 11. And I think all of the witnesses agreed that that is very difficult and uncertain. Examples of evidence about where forecasting made sense that was compelling to me were looking at the SALT reports, which are we're going to use a lot of acronyms today, and I think everyone's familiar with them who's part of the proceeding, but that's the capacity.
Okay, we're going to try not.
Okay. Well,
to the extent possible.
Okay.
I know it's not always possible.
So that's the capacity, energy loads, and transmission reports, and also the regional forecast of ISO New England. And those reports showed a declining demand over time, and I found those reports to be reliable and credible, and they were instructive in aiding my determination of need. I also didn't feel that evidence was rebutted by Invenergy. It was more interpreted. So I'll talk a little more about renewables later, but was very struck that since the 2016 advisory opinion of the PUC, that there's been a tremendous uptick in renewables. And we had some discussion of offshore wind, and indeed the PUC right in this room just earlier this spring approved a 400 megawatt project for Rhode Island, which is a significant amount of the energy need in Rhode Island. So I want to move on to, so those are just kind of preliminary comments about the emphasis on long-term and statewide planning. And
I'd like to also, if you're done with long-term, just another.
And by the way, I find I'm not really reading this, so maybe I'll try to do that. It's hard to read and have a discussion.
Got it. On the issue of long-term, I think that we had a lot of both testimony and evidence about how ISO New England operates and how they plan in the short term for their auction, just setting it up. The auction, of course, as we know, the forward part of it is because it's 3 years in advance. I think that it's important to recognize that the whole way that the forward capacity market is set up, the way that ISO New England uses the curve in order to figure out who qualifies, who doesn't qualify for the bidders. I think that it's clear that long-term planning is really, use a cooking analogy, baked in to the forward capacity market. While the results of any one particular year, the way that the market operates, I think that one shouldn't focus on just a single year, but looking at it in totality. That's one of the benefits that we've had in this case because it's gone on for so long. We have a fairly broad expanse of the operation of the ISO New England forward capacity market system. And in all of the evidence and testimony, we heard about that. The witnesses and evidence for the applicant's position came up short. The witnesses and the evidence for the opposing parties, I think, hit it clearly on the head. We're slipping into baseball analogies now. So I think to suggest that there's a problem there's any kind of a problem in what we have before us to look at, that there was not long-term planning behind all of the particular results or evidence, conclusions that we rely on. Clearly, long-term planning is involved in all of the things that we heard about. So I think that's just something that I would add to the remarks here.
Thanks, I agree, and I think the reports, the SELT reports and the forecasts gave us good information on a long-term forecast in which we justify our decision.
And it's important to keep in mind that the way that the auction then operates is that the bidders come in, and then ISO measures all of the bids against the aforementioned curve. But those bidders themselves are experts in long-term forecasting. Their entire livelihood is based on it. That's what they are thinking about when they're getting involved in the forward capacity auction. And so that's, I think, a clear indication that long-term planning is baked in, understanding that one has a capacity supply obligation for a certain amount of time means that you're going to be getting paid for that amount of time. But keep in mind, we're talking about independent generators, independent developers who are involved in thinking about how they are going to be able to benefit economically in bidding in for facilities just like the one proposed by Invenergy that will be operating for 20 or 30 years into the future. And so they have to be making those considerations before they're even entering into the bids. And so the way that things shake out as measured against the curve, particularly in the years that we've seen, I think fully support that all of that information is based on long-term planning, whether or not it's required that we find that party citizens are based on long-term, whether that's greater than 3 years, greater than 10 years. And there's clearly long-term planning involved in that. And it's the planning by the very people who are, upon whom it's, they're compelled to understand what the long-term forecast is for them, or they're going to lose money. So.
Yeah, I think that kind of trying to sharpen our pens and decide whether it's a 10-year or a 20-year scope for long-term isn't really needed or valuable.
I agree. Because it is in there. If you want to, if one wants to parse apart all of the individual pieces of testimony and evidence and say, oh, well, this shouldn't be looked at because it's like, it's all part of an organic whole, and it certainly involves long-term planning.
I would just say, in terms of the long-range planning that is done at the state level, the state guide plan elements and the long-range plans, such as our energy plan, are intended to be sort of they're guides, they're general in nature, they're not the experts on the topic. So for anything that we have, for our historic element, for our housing element, it doesn't tell us exactly how. It's not giving us a map. It's giving us a general overview. That's, you're taking an aerial photo. You're not looking at the individual roads to get there. What I see is the SELT reports and the ISO, all the forecasting that's done. It's a little bit like the state budget and the revenue estimating conference, where revenue estimating really tells you where you're getting the funding from. The state budget looks at it from, this is all in the general fund. The long-range plans we have are more the general fund, as an example, and the very specific individual elements, such as the proponent's proposed facility, are the individual elements, the individual revenues that we're seeing, so that our long-range planning that we're doing, whether it's 10 years or 20 years or however long it is only giving us a general direction to go, not the specifics, whereas the forecasting, I think, was very telling when we looked at that. So,
would you say, because this is how I see it, but you're the planner, then there really are so broad that being in conformance with a state guide plan element, it's not a fine point. I mean, they're intended, I'm sort of paraphrasing what you said, to be this framework in which decisions at a more fine level then need to be made based on other considerations.
I think that's a very good way to put it. It's the decision framework for making very specific decisions on individual developments and individual, so when we're looking, say, at growth centers, or we're looking at something that's recommended in our land use or our transportation plan, it might in general be, say, expansion of rail service. It doesn't tell us exactly how that's going to happen. So it's a general framework to look at the overall picture.
So I think, let me just kind of summarize my thinking on what we just discussed. So one is, I think that Invenergy is correct that this proposed facility conforms with the state guide plan, state energy plan. To me, that's not evidence on need. It's another element of the act. I think you're right, and I'll say some more about this later, Chairperson, that because this went on for so long, we got to have a sense of whose expert opinions played out, and not a sense of. We saw who's played out and whose didn't, and that certainly affected credibility. And so I'm not, and I think even if we did look out 20 years, it seems like the trends are for decreasing demand, and so it wasn't a compelling point anyway, but it wasn't a driver for me.
Excellent point. I like it.